If you missed part 1 of this series, then please click the link in the description box and watch that one first. In this, I take apart why I'm doing this series and answering the question whether the manifestation community is a cult. And I'm also really defining what a cult is so that we have a really good basis. So you can follow me for this part 2, where I'll take apart the characteristics of a cult and see if they apply to the manifestation community, so that at the end, we can have a full conclusion, whether it's a yes or a no. Hello, my loves. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. My name is Lorena. I'm a somatic self-concept and identity coach, and I support you in bridging the gap between who you currently are or perceive yourself as and who you desire to be or become. Welcome to part 2 of this series, Is the Manifestation Community a Cult? We're going to begin to dive into the characteristics of a cult and see if they apply to this community. So for these characteristics, I'm going to use a framework or a list of characteristics that has been established by a psychologist that specializes in cults. I hope I'm not butchering his name. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but I believe his name is Michael Langone. He's an American psychologist who devoted a lot of his life to studying cults. If you want to learn more about him, you can look up the International Cultic Studies Association, which is a non-profit organization, and he identifies 12 characteristics of cults or high control groups. So this is the framework that we're going to use today. Let's begin with number 1, and I'm going to look down and read out these characteristics. The group displays excessively zealous and unquestioning commitment to its leader, and whether he's alive or dead, regards his belief system, ideology, and practices as the truth, as law. I'm just going to let that one sink in, because honestly, for the manifestation community, especially the community around Neville Goddard's teachings, this feels incredibly accurate. Interestingly, given that Neville Goddard is dead, and that the community and his work is now focused online, and it had a real boom a few years ago, where I feel like he's got more popular now than he was decades ago. It's not one of those cases where he became a cult leader and then people just took his words as gospel and then he died and people just continued to preach it. It's more so that him and his work became the object of admiration as a result of groupthink, induced by this globalization, induced by the birth of this or rise of this online community. So when I say groupthink, what I mean by this is where a group develops that is completely in conformity with regards to their beliefs or their opinion, so that they maintain harmony within the group, consistency within the group, and just peace, rather than question the perspectives. And I'll get more into this later in other points of these characteristics. But this is definitely something that I have seen show up. Certain practices, techniques, or even the concept of manifestation, and in Goddard's context or community, the so-called law of assumption, is quite literally seen as law. It's even named law. Now, there's usually 2 things that play out. Often people come into this community and they begin the practices in hopes of receiving certain manifestations, of making certain desires come true, make them become reality. And although they don't see the results that they want, the hope that they might, that they hopefully will, keeps them hooked. The promise that one day they will, if they only persist, really keeps them hooked, even if they see no results. Now, this is also a very common thing in cults. Nobody joins a cult because they want to join a cult. Nobody joins a cult with the awareness that it's a cult. If you watch interviews or read books from people who have escaped cults, nobody joined because they wanted to admire a leader. They all were seeking something. They all thought there was something in there for them that could improve their life, or sometimes they thought they could do something for the world, for other people. And the destructive elements only happened later on. And what often keeps them inside the cult is the hope that one day this will work. One day they will get out of this what they went into it for. One day the world will change. Many cults lure their members in with promises. That could be promises of success, promises of enlightenment, spiritual advancement, or an eternal life. And these promises are never fulfilled, but they're essentially being breadcrumbed, to use a word from today's dating culture. So often, the hope for improvement keeps people hooked, also in the manifestation community. And in this community, in this space, the captivating thing is, the hook is that they will get their deepest desires. Any desires, whether that's to get their ex back, whether that's getting wealthy and successful, whatever it is. And that's a really tempting reason to stick with it. Now, it's also sometimes the case, and that was the case for me when I first got into this space, into this online community, was that often when people get into it, they do see results. They see some results, and that has been my experience as well. It is ultimately, when it hit a point of stagnation, really got me to dive a lot more deeper into trauma resolution, subconscious work, and prioritizing self-concept work, which is what I now teach and how I now coach my clients as well, because I hit this wall and it was just keeping me hooked enough. I got just enough to keep me going, but I never got the fulfillment I was actually seeking. Because the interesting and dangerous thing with cults and cult-like thinking is that there is usually some truth to it. It does usually work in some ways until it doesn't. Due to misconceptions, control, abuse, sometimes idolization, the truth is there, but that remains at the core, and all the stuff around it becomes really harmful, destructive, dangerous. I think a really good example for this is the cult NXVIM. If you're not familiar with this, I highly recommend checking out I believe it's on HBO, documentary The Vow. I'm going to see if I find some resources and I'll link them in the description below about this cult. But when I watched this documentary series for the first time, what really stood out for me was that I thought, wow, I would have been an ideal candidate for this cult. They definitely would have roped me in. It was based on business coaching. It was based on spiritual practices. It was based on overcoming fears, spiritual and psychological advancement. Those are all things that I'm interested in. And what intrigued me was that many of the things they did were true and they worked until it didn't anymore, until a line was crossed, until the abuse, psychopathy, and narcissism came through and people were severely traumatized. Now, in a much lighter way, but still in some way and in some more isolated parts of the manifestation community, it might be fully applicable. But in some way, this is true in the manifestation community as well. These practices do work, but at some point, there's often a line that is being crossed or taken to an extreme. You can see this in some parts of the community that have very solipsistic worldviews, where the concept that everyone as you pushed out is being interpreted as you are the only one that exists and everyone else is just a puppet. How dangerous. How does that make you treat your children, your loved ones, the people you should have compassion for? If you only focus on your own perspective, your own projections, you neglect everyone around you and you're not going to be a good person. It's a very ego-led approach to spiritual work. It's spiritual bypassing. This is also evident in an attempt to control your circumstances, or even a person, like make someone love you, manifest somebody to make them love you. So this is all part of groupthink, and it's interesting how this sometimes becomes its own entity at some point. It's almost like a virus. It mutates and it takes on a life of its own. And we can look at this in an overarching way, like, for example, the teachings around Neville Goddard and the groupthink that sometimes evolves from that. But where it gets much more destructive and dangerous is in isolated circles. So that could be groups around coaches, for example. So I have seen this where coaches or influencers or spiritual teachers, so-called spiritual teachers in these industries and in the online world portray themselves as some type of guru who has more answers than other people. So then sometimes a coach will attempt to create a cult-like following themselves. And sometimes people do, but even if there is no intentionality or ill intent, I get that it can sometimes be a fine line not to create that cult-like following, because you're creating a community when you're showing up online and when you're a coach and when you're a leader in some way. You do create a community, and so it can sometimes be a fine line between community and cult. Especially if you're selling something, right? When you do have something to offer, a service, a teaching, a course, of course you sell it. I do that too. I share testimonials from clients. I share what's happening in my program. Of course I do. That's marketing as well. And although I don't portray myself as the one who has all the answers or anything like that, I mean, I know my method works, and I'm sure there's other things that work that I'm maybe not aware of. But even though I don't portray myself as that, it can be read or interpreted as that by other people. Maybe if they have made negative experiences before, or if they just misinterpret or misread what I actually mean. Because everybody looks through things through their own lens, their own perspective, right? And there's only so much control that I have over what I share, and I can't give disclaimers for every little thing. There's no time, there's no space for this. But the problematic stuff is really when it happens with the intent to create division, the intent to create a cult-like following for your own benefit, for your own ego, for your own narcissism. Let's look at the second characteristic of a cult. Questioning, doubt, and dissent are discouraged or even punished. Now, I would definitely say this applies too. And I don't know how much it applies anymore, but I have seen this in Facebook groups years and years ago when I was still active in them, where when somebody would question a teaching or a perspective, or they would say something that doesn't align with the consensus of the groupthink, remember, they would be shamed, they would be shunned, sometimes the post would be deleted, they'd be blocked, they'd be kicked out of the group. This has happened to me too. I remember I was kicked out of a group once because I said something that didn't align with the beliefs of the majority of the group. And I think this also became very apparent, and I think some people woke up from that during that time, which is really great, in 2020, when a lot of difficult things were happening in the world, and when people would start questioning it and ask, did I create this? Did I create this horrible thing that's happening? Am I manifesting these awful things that are happening? And maybe questioning that it wasn't the individual's responsibility, what happens in the entire world. We have a lot of impact, right? Like if you change your self-concept, you're automatically going to inspire other people in the collective to change. But not every circumstance in your life and in the world is due to you or your responsibility, not at all. But these harder, more difficult topics were often something that wasn't even allowed to be talked about. Or what I would also see is that people would completely self-abandon and neglect themselves and their needs and their boundaries because I can just manifest the other person differently rather than just set a boundary with them. So what would then happen frequently, and I've seen this happen with people, and that breaks my heart, that they would stay in toxic, abusive relationships, for example, because they thought it was their fault anyway. And what was the consequence of that? More groupthink. People would just not dare to speak up anymore. People would seek faults within themselves. I've also heard this from people who have worked with a coach who really drilled in that they should flip their thoughts or affirm themselves into oblivion or ignore their reality, which are all things that I have always spoken up and out against, because I think this approach is absolutely not sustainable and completely neglects the humanity in us, this beautiful gift of feeling deeply and having emotions and having the full spectrum of thoughts and emotions and reality and physicality. It neglects all of that. But as a coach, yeah, there is some element of needing to challenge your clients. I do that too. But there also is an element of validating their experience and really listening to them and seeing them being witnessed in their experience. But instead, what I've been hearing from so many people is that they would just be told to ignore their reality, ignore what's happening, ignore what they're feeling, or think something else. And what is the result of that? It's that people don't process their emotions, let alone their trauma, properly anymore, which is something that we're not taught in the first place. It's something that nobody is taught unless you do this deep work with a coach or therapist who's trauma trained, you don't do this type of work. You don't know how to do it. And then if you're told to repress it more and more, it gets worse and worse. No wonder you come out of it feeling more frustrated and more depressed and more anxious. So then people start suppressing what they're truly feeling. They create more trauma in their system and things just get worse for them. It's okay to question things. It's okay to question spiritual texts, and it's okay to question what somebody's telling you. It's okay to question what your coach is saying. They're not there to advise you. I'm not there to just give you the answers. I'm here to help you find your own. And I have learned from some of my clients, right? Sometimes somebody shares something and I'm like, okay, I get you, I hear you, but also this is happening in this order or this way for a specific purpose, and, see how it feels for you. And at the end, if you really go all in, at the end, you'll see, how it benefits you, and we can talk again, so trust the process a little. But I've also had experiences where clients gave me feedback and I'm like, you know what, you're right, I'm going to change this. Thanks for the input. Because we all evolve as people. And one of the hallmarks of a community, even if it has a leader, which as a coach, I automatically am in the community that I basically have in my program with my clients, it doesn't mean that I'm better. It doesn't mean that I'm higher up. One of the hallmarks of a community is that everyone has a say, everyone has their voice, everyone can speak up. A community isn't created by one person, it's created by the collective. What I've also seen happen, and this is one that really rubs me the wrong way, because if you're familiar with my content, you know that I'm a big advocate of shadow work and shadow integration. Because if you don't look at what's in your subconscious, if you don't look at the parts in yourself that you neglect, that you repress, that you deny, that you don't want to be there, and if you don't integrate them, you're going to be in continued resistance and repression, and that's when what you resist persists, right? But I have seen people use their damn spiritual ego in order to abuse concepts like, or modalities like shadow work. There are coaches out there who claim to see other people's shadows, which, by the way, is not how shadow work works. If we were in a session and we were working on shadow integration together, it's not me telling you what your shadows are. We're uncovering it together, but it's your exploration. I'm just holding the space, holding the container, guiding the process of it. I don't see your shadows. It's not a psychic process. It's your subconscious, not mine. But there are people who claim to know or recognize other people's shadows. But what they really do is they abuse their position as a coach. And instead of looking within and looking at their own shadows and their own projections, when somebody will set a boundary, they will say, oh, that's just your shadow. I knew you had the shadow. So they'll just tell their clients that they are projecting when they are likely the ones that are projecting themselves. Which is also why, by the way, as a coach, as a leader, it's so important to do your own work first and foremost. It's why I continually hire people as well, why I get support, because I need to make sure that my own emotional space is clear so that I don't project onto my clients, because we're all human here. So there is a lot of potential for abuse in these circles. And yeah, sometimes it is projection. Sometimes the person has some trauma and is just expressing their thoughts in that way. But even if somebody's projecting onto me, which does happen, I still receive it. I don't make them wrong for it. I still listen to them. I would never shut down somebody's perspective, even if I have a hunch that it's a skewed perspective. I stay curious and I have an open mind and I'm willing to be wrong, even if that's sometimes uncomfortable. I would love to hear your thoughts about these 2 points and all the comments I've made about it. Share your experiences, share your opinion in the comments. And then next week, we are diving into some more characteristics of cults and how they apply to the manifestation community. I'll see you then.